Hi, Misha here. And recently, at least I thought I planned it up first. Maybe I didn't. Who knows? I just recorded a video on this. This is the Hawker Seahawk. This is a 1/72 scale diecast model from Aviation'72. And because it's so closely related, I thought, why not revisit the Hawker Hunter? Plus, I have a new model to show. This is the F.6. This is pretty much the penultimate fighter interceptor version. And this is from Corgi. It's an older Corgi, back when they did fixed landing gear. At least for some of them, it's called their Legend series. It's a bit more of an economy. But I also have the one you saw in a couple of older videos. Also from Corgi. This is from the Aviation Archive. And this is their T.7 trainer. So it's the 2-seat version. These are also sometimes used for ground attack and other support roles. So, yeah, why did I think to do the Hunter when doing a video on the Seahawk? Well, because this was really the beginning. After World War II, the Labour government in the UK pretty much put the kibosh on new aircraft being adopted. They only allowed for testing and evaluation. The Seahawk would end up being just about the only new service craft to go into full adoption and production. And this was done thanks to Hawker. The RAF really didn't want it at first, and the Navy wasn't sure, but they would end up adopting it. Yeah, check out that video if you're interested in more of this history. And that prototype was known as the P-1040. That was the general purpose, the land version. The naval version here was the 1046. Well, after this had a successful first test flight, Hawker developed the P-1052. And that was taking this design and essentially giving it a 35-degree swept wing. And this happened in 1948, and the RAF checked it out. They liked it, but they didn't really need it. They couldn't maybe even get it according to the government, so it didn't go much of anywhere until 1950 and the Korean War. And at that time, the RAF realized they were way behind the game, both compared to American and Soviet fighter technology. It's often been stated, aka Wikipedia says it, that they lost an entire generation of military fighters, and it's kind of hard to argue that they didn't. So they put out an urgent request for a new daytime fair weather interceptor, and they selected two. They selected the design from Hawker, which they had looked at for several years, and they also selected kind of a backup design from Supermarine, the Swift. And Hawker had kept on working. There was another project, the P-1081, which kind of went away from the split intake and exhaust and went to a single jet exhaust in the back, but still keeping the split intakes in the front. That was a bit of a dead-end design, but it definitely led to work on the P-1067, which was the immediate prototype of what would become the Hunter, which flew in the summer of 1951. And really, its big change, we would go to to the large exhaust, we would go to not only a sweep to the wing, but also a sweep to the tailplane. And these different changes and everything made it a much faster craft than the Seahawk. The Seahawk had good range, good endurance, but it was only 600 miles per hour. This was designed to be transonic, meaning it could go over 0.9 Mach. And because of the Korean War, it was pretty much rushed through. They had a few different prototypes and upgrades, 52, 53, different testing. They would test some fully armed up versions. And it would go into service in 1954. So much like the Seahawk, just barely missing the war. There'd be the initial F1 fighter version. It would have the new Avon engine, which some didn't have faith in, so they would go to the F2, which would have the Sapphire engine. This would kind of be a back and forth between the Sapphire and the Avon over its production run. By 55, they would go to the F4 and F5, which would have better fuel storage, and they would have 2 wet plumbed hard points on the wings for drop tanks, as you can see here. And then in 56, pretty much the ultimate interceptor version, again with an uprated Avon engine, would be introduced as the F.6, and it would have 4 wet hard points. It would also introduce this dog tooth, as it's called, kind of edge to the wing. And along the way they would also introduce little blisters underneath to catch spent casings from the cannon. And with that, let's talk about specs. This is nearly 46 feet long, so a little longer than the Seahawk. On the other hand, its wingspan is less than 34 feet, because again, it's a swept wing. It was quite fast for its day and time. In fact, it held speed records briefly. When it was over 30,000 feet, it could do about 620 to 630 miles per hour, but when it was closer to sea level, it could get over 700 miles per hour. It could also climb up to 50,000 feet. So in every way, it had better performance than the Seahawk. Well, I say that, except again for its range, but they were working on it. You know, the F1, the F2, but they were adding the ability for drop tanks, and they improved the internal fuel storage and all that. Of course, the downside of the drop tanks, that did negatively impact the plane's maneuverability and speed, so it was always a trade-off. Whereas the Seahawk was armed with 4 20mm cannons, this had 4 30mm cannon with 150 rounds each, and they were actually loaded and maintained through a pack system. Now, the barrels were part of the plane, but it had a pack that could be removed to resupply or refurbish, repair. Pretty neat system. And again, this was originally designed as a daytime, a fair weather interceptor fighter, and it would serve alongside the Javelin, which was the nighttime, or all weather, crummy weather counterpart. That said, even though it was a daytime, this was one of the first fully radar-equipped planes to be in the RAF. It was relatively inexpensive to operate and maintain, so it wasn't a high-budget project, and it really helped the RAF catch up with the West and the East in terms of fighter tech. Along with the Seahawk, this was used in the Suez Crisis. Although, as I said in that video, it was mostly used for local defense because of its short range. But as the F.6 came out, this would be improved upon again and again. It would also be used extensively during the Brunei Uprising or Rebellion in 1962. And there, one of its new capabilities with newer versions came into effect. It was used for ground strafing and ground attack. Because while this was a perfectly good, capable interceptor by the 50s, by the 60s, the new English Electric Lightning was coming online. So these started to be replaced in 1960, and really by 63, the Hawker Hunter was out of the fighter business, out of the interceptor business. You know, this was transonic, so a little under the speed of sound. The Electric Lightning could go 2 times the speed of sound. And kind of like with the Hunter as it came in, originally the Lightning had the issue with the short range, short duration, but just as the Hunter had been improved, so too had the Lightning by 63, 64, 65. And that could have been the end of it. You know, this was a time when jets were coming in and out of service very rapidly. But instead, they did give it a new lease on life. Just thought we'd focus on this one for a bit. Why not? I kind of like the side-by-side cockpit on the training version. It's very bizarre looking. Cool. Anyway, they would rework it as a ground attack flavor known as the FGA-9 or Mark 9. This could have 4 hard points, and it could carry bombs or unguided rockets. And even later on, some versions were equipped with Sidewinder or even Maverick missiles. Now, typically, I think these were more for foreign contracts because by that point, the RAF was kind of no longer using them. But anyway, you know, it was reworked for that and used extensively in the 60s and through the 70s as a ground attack and, you know, close air support craft to help troops on the ground. And it was very popular. Again, it was the Hunter had an easy maintenance routine, and it worked. And it had the speed and maneuverability. And, of course, the ordnance and everything loaded up on it didn't do anything for its speed or maneuverability, but it was already pretty decent, and being transonic didn't hurt it, so it actually ended up having a very good lease on life as a ground attack. It was also used as a reconnaissance bird. So it would continue in that role until the early 80s, when it would be replaced with newer designs such as the Supercut Jaguar and Tornado, or Tornado if you will. Ended up having a very successful career, over 30 years. But even as the single-seat versions were being pulled out of service, actually the 2-seater over here, the Mark 7 and the Mark 8s, would be kept in use quite heavily through the 80s and even through the 90s as training airplanes for the good old Blackburn Buccaneer, which was first used by the Royal Navy, but then when they retired their carriers, it would be inherited by the RAF and used extensively there. It wasn't until the Buccaneers were finally retired in the 90s that the Hunter trainers were no longer needed. And like I said, I've read some reports. The 2-seat version was also used for ground attack and kind of close support and reconnaissance, which would make sense, since they did make several of these. And speaking of that, they would make just under 2,000, first at Hawker Group and then later Hawker Siddeley. And of those 2,000, just under half were for export customers, export contracts. So this was a pretty popular plane with allies of the Commonwealth. So it was not just a British RAF bird. I just think it's a neat plane. I've always had kind of a soft spot. It has that cross section. It's a pretty modern design, but then you look kind of at the exhaust and it has that more that 50s look. I don't know, just it's a very neat feeling plane to me. Like I said, both of these models are from Corgi. This is an earlier one. Still has the tanks, like I said, landing gear, and the flap is in the down position. It does have crew in the front though. It's got your typical detail and nice Corgi construction, but these don't come with the stand or anything. So that's my fighter version. And then this is the more, fancy one. It has gear up or down, flap up or down. The crew, of course, aren't removable. That's not something typically Corgi does, but the fuel tanks are removable. It's got a little more fine detail to it. And it seems like for whatever reason, Corgi made more of the training version than they did the fighter version, which is okay. Like I said, I really actually like the side-by-side seated cockpit. I think it's a neat design. And since these were used longer as trainers than they were even ground attack planes, it's very fitting. So this thing kind of went through 3 stages. Originally as a fighter interceptor in the 50s, and then kind of a ground attack close support in the 60s and 70s, and then as a advanced trainer in the 80s and 90s. So not bad at all for a design that can be directly traced back to nearly World War II, certainly in the late 40s. So I just thought we'd revisit it. Why not? I had fun. I hope you did too. If you could, like, share, and subscribe. And also check out some of my other videos if you have time. I do appreciate you tuning in, and I will catch you very soon next time.